Hello and welcome to our episode 3 of our Security and Risk Professionals Insight series. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the editor with MySecurityTV, and we are looking at advancements and applications for critical infrastructure protection and high security environments. I mentioned this is episode 3. Some of the protocols, if you haven't joined us before, this is a recorded session and will be available on demand. We'll go for around about 60 minutes and please use the Q&A, and you're welcome to use the Q&A during this particular session. And this is also one of our events leading up to the Indo-Pacific Space and Earth Conference later in the year. Some of our channels here is we have the Drastic, so drasticnews.com is our drones, robotics and AI channel. This touches on a little bit of space as well, and also our CCTV buyer's guide, where we'll cover off on video surveillance and analytics. So welcome to check those out. Also, this will be available on MySecurityTV, as I mentioned, on demand, and part of our Australia in Space channel as well. This series is part of a range of physical in-person events that we're also doing. We just held one in Perth recently, the impact of technology, autonomy and remote operations on the future workforce. And we were in Melbourne last week looking at the risk in an augmented world, also looking at AI, deep fakes and the like. And we've got some other events coming up in Sydney, Brisbane and Sunshine Coast, as well as Perth. So please check that out, and I'll have some more details at the end of this session. And as I mentioned, IPSEC, this is the second episode of the Indo-Pacific Space and Earth Conference. You check out waspacweek.com.au, and there's a 3-day exhibition along with the 30th APRSAF, the Asia Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum in Australia, and the Andy Thomas Space Foundation. So go check that out, and we'll be in Perth for a WA Space Week in November. This is looking at CPTED and crime prevention and detection. Plus, we're going to have a drone legislation briefing and using RPAS for emergency services. Thank you very much for the panel. We've got Dionisopoulos, the Senior Security Consultant and the ASIS New South Wales Chair. We've got Kate Hampson in Perth, Graduate Security Consultant with ARUP, and she's the NEXTGEN Lead, ASIS WA Chapter. So Kate, thanks for joining us. Codee Ludbey CPP, he's the Director and Senior Security Consultant with Core 42. And Luke Percy-Dove in Melbourne, Senior Security Consultant with the Matrix Consulting. And our special guest today, Superintendent Daly, over in Perth. He's the Chair of the National Police RPAS Working Group, and we're going to hear from Paul as we kick off. Just acknowledging our sponsors. We can't do these series without our sponsors. Our national sponsor is Curtin University. Our series sponsor, Security Exhibition and Conference, and their Cyber Pavilion, which will be in Sydney at the ICC 21st to the 23rd of August. DavCore Group with their EVA Access to Security and the EKA Cyberlock. Thank you very much to the DavCore Group. And our industry supporters, ASIS International, ASIL, the Australian Security Industry Association, and the AIPIO, the Australian Institute for Intelligence Professional Officers. So thank you to all of those supporters that are with us. Paul, thank you very much for joining us today. And we've been in correspondence for some time over this as well, and I've been keeping an eye on it, as we do on our Drastic channel. Maybe I'll hand over to you in terms of the police working group. We'll stay on the camera, and also for the audience, if you've got any questions along this, welcome to fire them in to Paul. But you've now created an instrument under the CASA regulations to allow you to mainly be on visual line of sight as the sort of the key one here, but maybe talk us to the working group, what your focus was, and what some of the outcomes are for you.
Yeah, good to be here, Chris. Thanks. It hopefully it's the first of many that we get to get over the line. But essentially, the catalyst was that a few years ago, when the regulations were being created, there was no carve out for emergency services, not just law enforcement, but emergency services in general, to be able to do things that perhaps our regular, ordinary industry can't do. So various RPAS units within law enforcement across the country have evolved at different stages, but we're all at a level now where we found we were all suffering from the same issues. So it was a case of rather than one individual organisation or law enforcement group going to CASA at a time, we can all get this around a table, get together. What is it we're all suffering from? and as a collective group go to CASA and work with them to see what could be done. And it's been a little bit of a journey so far, 12, nearly 14 months. But a lot of that's understanding, getting some common ground, some shared understanding our business. Unless you've lived and breathed and walked a mile in a police uniform, it's difficult to understand what it is we do each day. And getting that shared understanding, and CASA have got that first one over the line for us. A lot of people, and that first one really relates to indoor flight. So the ability to be outside, and we call it a stronghold, or a venue, a premises, whatever you want to call it, and to be able to launch a drone from outside and fly that into the premises looking for the threat therein, which could be an offender, it may well be an IED, booby traps, whatever it is. But so that's the BVLOS bit that has come in. So a lot of people are, why that one? Why is that the biggest thing that you guys needed to do first? And simply that reduces the greatest amount of risk to us as first responders.
So you're going on as a sort of risk-based approach. You have a sort of a program of work that you want to do, and this was the first one. And this is maybe just talk through the instrument. So it's an exemption instrument under the CASA was EX1924 indoor operation of RPA near people and BVLOS beyond visual line of sight. You took this is say 14 months. How many are on the working group?
So we have all the chief pilots from around the state. So there's 7 of them plus the 2 AFP and Border Force are on as well. So that takes us to 9. There's a couple of more senior officers that come along as well, and then me as well. There's a few subject matter experts that tag along. So I'd say there's probably about 15 if you got us all in the room together, and then 4 or 5 from the CASA side of the house that come along to listen, understand, and guide and assist. So
and
yeah,
I was going to say the instrument itself, is there an approval process, or you've got it, you can just use it operationally as required?
No, we still have to log our flights, and certainly the chief pilots, we'll use AVCRM, which is a real bonus because it's a consistent approach across the board. But yeah, flights still have to be approved, and then once we're off and running, it's no problem. But it's the BVLOS bit that everyone's particularly interested in, and that's really focused around CASA. Were really generous, I guess is the word, in acknowledging that they couldn't really put you got to be within 1 metre, 10 metres, 100 metres of a stronghold, particularly when considering there might be bullets and God knows what getting fired back at us. So taking that shelter protection or beyond visual line of sight has given us that extra safety. And then, of course, the ability to go within 30 metres of people, there's a reasonable expectation that if we're flying into a stronghold, we're going to be coming within a certain distance of that target inside. So we needed exemption to that as well. Obviously, a number of safeguards that we put in place, the size of the drone, the props are protected, people going in there with the drone, i.e. our TAC teams and things like that. They also have their PPE, so minimising any risk or harm to anybody. But really fundamentally, and anyone who knows law enforcement, we are starved of situational awareness. What's going on? If we know exactly where that person is, we know what's strapped to their chest, we know what sort of environment we're heading into, we make better decisions, reducing risk.
And I suppose the regulatory framework this is a federal act and federal regulation, therefore the states need to comply. Is that the framework that you had to deal with? That was limiting you?
Well, you've got federal regulations, so that's everyone affected by that. So they're all affected by the regs. But then you've got things like conflicting legislation from a state level. So you've got occupational health and safety legislation that states that an employer will create a safe working environment. Well, it's a no-brainer that drones, instead of a human, creates a safer environment for us. So it's working through those little rub points, which assisted us, but also assisted CASA in understanding some of those bits. There's also things like insurance. If you're operating against a regulation, then insurance have a right to say, you're breaking the law, we're not going to cover you. Optics, not a good look for law enforcement to be going against regs that are there to protect everybody. So, yeah, one of those anomalies, I think it was just a missed opportunity and the unforeseen knock-on consequences that we're currently faced with. So CASA have been fantastic in being able to help and work with us and provide us a team. So it's just a getting that shared understanding.
Does it have to be a police officer, or can you use your contractors as well, third-party operators, as long as they're sort of acting in an operational capacity?
So right now it has to be a police officer, but they're looking at broadening that. We put a sunset clause in on this initial instrument because we don't know, and CASA don't know if we've got it right. Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to change things? How's it working? So we're training and we're implementing this into our operations now. But the sunset clause allows us then to either redefine it, rework it, if there's hooks in it that are causing us pain still, and we'll revisit that end of September. But we're looking to broaden that out so that we can make it might be a civilian that flies for law enforcement purposes. Some agencies do have them, so they'll broaden that out hopefully. And then also broaden the definition, not just law enforcement, but emergency services. Because like our fireys, they've got a use case straight off the bat. Why walk into a building that's on fire when you could put a drone in there?
Well, and again, it has impacts on the security sector as well,
Absolutely.
providing that surveillance as well as patrolling capability as well on this. Look, just welcome, before we finish off with Paul, welcome any questions from the audience. I suppose one of this, is the working group interested in submissions from industry, or how have you worked with industry in this? I take it you might have done some operational tests and capability demonstrations and the like, how it might actually work. How closely do you find that you're working with industry on this?
Not so much with industry. I'm leveraging off the law enforcement from around the world. So I've been fortunate enough to travel to the US, and I've got contacts in Canada, Sweden, Norway, the European countries, which have all progressed through this. So learning a lot of their lessons first around how they've managed to do things. So really, haven't needed to reach into industry for their support, other than what some of the products they provide us.
Yeah,
but really,
it was mainly on the product side. But I imagine we're seeing, obviously watching what's happening in Ukraine and in sort of conflict zones as well, and swarms as well, as not just entertainment, but obviously drone swarms and the like.
Yeah.
Maybe a question might be can you give us an insight into what is coming down the pipeline, what you might have in the works? Is this a permanent working group moving forward?
Well, we've got a number of things that we want to look at. One is that BVLOS exemption. Our operating environment is the community. Anywhere in the state we operate in, we may need drones. So we want the ability to be able to fly over the top of people and places. But again, not to prowl around and look for work. There's enough of that going on. It's more to deal with what's going on in front of us. The number of times where we go on and executed a search warrant and the offender squirts out the back door, over the fence, cue the Benny Hill music, and we're off to the races, jumping fences and chasing people. Well, a drone overhead that can just go with that person. You've got a reference point, you've got your evidence, you've got your offender bagged and tagged. It would just be a crystal ball question to say, if we didn't get him then, when would we have got him?
Yeah.
But to be able to wrap it up there and then is a real godsend for us. So that's the sort of thing we need to look for. Emergency approvals, because a lot of what happens we react to. We don't have the ability to say at 10 o'clock there's going to be an incident, so we'll be ready for it. So there can be that time delay between popping a drone up and getting a job on the system. So a few of those sort of just out of the box things that will assist us do our job. But it's the BVLOS will be the big one. I'm dropping and discharging. That's the other one as well.
That's within this, or?
Yeah, that'll be part of the work that we want to do. Another exemption we'll apply for. Why would we be dropping stuff from a drone? A negotiator who's talking to someone on a bridge who's mad, bad or sad and thinking about ending it all, rather than yelling through a loudhailer, sometimes it'd be nicer just to fly a phone up to them. That hiker that's fallen down a cliff, broken their ankle, and we found them, but it's going to take a while to set up ropes and to be able to fly them a penthroid stick for pain management, or some food to keep them going while we're getting ourselves organised. Flashbangs out the back of a stronghold if you want to create a distraction, to drop that from a drone while you're keeping an operator out the front going through the front door. There's lots of creative ways for us to use these sort of things. So that's another thing we're looking for.
Well, I'm even thinking the responsive drones, say from a security system, are you able to acquire or have acquisition of civilian drones that might be there in a security setting? The alarm goes off, the drone goes up above the building, and therefore it's exempt with if it's giving access to police and the like.
Yeah, I don't know. We haven't even looked at that example, but there's
There
a
you go.
feed that can come through us. If that satisfies our need for situational awareness, then we'd be keen to entertain that. How
Yeah.
that would work. And again, it's the customers getting their asset protected. We're responding to a crime, getting the situational awareness that we need. Yeah, if there's some way to incorporate in that feed, that would be a really interesting thing to explore.
Okay. Well, it's those kind of things we'll have a chat about as a panel now, and we're going to be looking at crime prevention through environmental design and crime detection. And I think these do create new tools. We've also got the scene. It's interesting how you've had this capability with robotics with no need to regulate, and now drones, robots and drones often come together now as well. So it's interesting you had to create a working group just for a particular unique piece of technology when you can do it on the ground, no problem. So it's definitely something we're going to see more and more. So Superintendent Paul Daly, thank you so much for that. And there's no questions from the audience, so we're going to let you go and appreciate your time.
You're welcome, no problem. And if my details are there, feel free to share, and happy to entertain anything offline. Be
Will
safe.
do, mate. Thank you very much. Thank you. Cheers. Okay. He's off, and maybe I'll introduce our panel now. Hey, get back. So we've got George, Kate, Codee, and Luke. Luke and Codee in particular, thank you very much for joining us once again. We've had you on for the last sort of 3 or 4 years as we run this series. George, I know very well as the new ASIS New South Wales chair, and Kate Hampson reached out, and thank you to Kevin Foster for recommending Kate. And we'll bring you up all on screen. I've lost you in front of me. And this is what we're going to discuss. And again, welcome input from the audience. Just get a sense of overview and update of the ISO CPTED standards, some state-based guidelines. Are you seeing these being applied and where? The trends are interested in integrated buildings, place and autonomous systems and video analytics for public safety. A little bit what we just saw there. But again, if you have a walk around Singapore, you'll see robots on patrol day to day also. And then a little bit what we're seeing, particularly with attacks here in Sydney in shopping precincts and the like, and then domestic violence, knife-related crime, places of worship and protests, and where does CPTED play a role? And we might actually start off with Kate in terms of risk evaluation frameworks for the public safety function. And Kate, I understand you're looking at women's safety as well in a risk framework. So I've just lost you. There you are. Beg your pardon. Kate, as you're a graduate consultant, which is always great to see, and we'll come to Codee after this as well in terms of the research that Codee's doing at PhD. But yeah, Kate, a little bit more on your research project that you're doing. You're doing a Masters by Research?
Yes, that's correct. So I just started my Masters by Research this year, and it's seeking to investigate an appropriate design philosophy of the built environment, specifically for women. So as the literature tells us, there is an evident gender bias within these public spaces, and they can potentially disregard the needs of women and gender diverse communities as well. So I'll be looking at particularly situational crime prevention. So in my early literature reviews at the moment, I've identified many crime prevention and safety strategies really fail to consider the different ways in which women and men use the built environment. This includes potential barriers, so fear of crime, perceptions of safety, particularly in regards to sexual violence. Whilst these solutions are effective, they can be oversimplistic, and they don't always necessarily consider the needs of a specific environment or user group such as women. There's been quite a bit of research to actually support this in recent times, particularly by XYX Lab and ARUP. And one of the key findings that we found from this, that brighter lighting and overlit spaces does not necessarily lead or correlate to improved perceptions of safety. So my study will be looking at to argue that women's feelings of safety and actual perceived safety can be mitigated through developing a particular framework that is underpinned by situational crime prevention theory to provide that higher degree of risk mitigation efficacy. So it'll be really about understanding what are the gaps in our current literature, the disconnect in terms of our urban planning, our architecture, the way that technology is used to support these elements, and how we can actually create a framework. And so consultants, architects, and industry professionals can really pick it up and apply it to mitigate those specific threats against women.
Nice. It sounds more like a PhD body of work. That I did my honours research in a public. It wasn't my honours, a big pun. It was, but we looked at women's safety at Murdoch University. There was a number of serial sex attacks there. The Claremont serial killer was live at the time as well. And we did a CPTED review of that, and women's feeling of safety is absolutely very different, and men and women perceive the environment different. I'll come to you, Codee. How does that sound? I'll come back to you, Kate. I'll just plan a question with you. Are you seeing any gaps within the current guidelines and standards? But Codee, that type of research has a lot of merit.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's great to see that we're starting to get serious about understanding how different user groups experience space. CPTED as a strategy and a design process has been around for a very long time, emerging in the 70s. But it's often talked about things like the community perception of safety and how to think about how a community comes together to create safe places. But it's never been as actionable in the guidance as some of the other things like, natural surveillance and natural access control and making sure that your hedges are a certain height so that you have good sight lines. That's very actionable advice. The guidelines and the standards talk to some of the things Kate's mentioned, but it doesn't provide that same actionable evidence-based advice around how practitioners can actually go about implementing these things at a community level. And that's one of the things I'm looking at as well in my research, which is we have this concept in urban design known as place and placemaking, and that is how a community forms attachments and bonds with public places and how a community is knit together by the places that they share and experience together. When you put security on top of that, if you're not thinking about the community and who actually lives there, you can actually disrupt those community bonds. So if you imagine, for example, teenagers loitering outside of shopping centres, a lot of people see that as a net negative. It impacts people's experience of that space. But from the teenagers' perspective, they might not have anywhere else in the community to hang out. There might not be any skate parks or public areas where they're actually allowed to just exist as people. And by implementing all the CPTED rules around, move on people that are loitering, set rules of behaviour and so on, you could actually be moving that teenage group, for example, into nefarious activities to stay entertained. They're not allowed to just sit outside the shops. So they go and do a bit of vandalism down the road. Maybe they'll get into graffiti. They hang out at the park that's actually meant for young families. So by not looking at the user groups and what their needs and wants are from a security perspective, we can actually just, create more tensions and problems in a community.
And
that's really
crime displacement. Yeah. Well, it's
Correct.
that interdependency I like and why CPTED's always been sort of an interesting topic. If anything, I just find sometimes it's a bit overwhelming with some of the guidelines. I had a look at the new WA guidelines. It's just because it's a very complex area, and then trying to document it. One of the questions I had within this session is how to present a good CPTED report, because when you look at it deeply, like you are, both Kate and Codee, in the research concept, you get a sense of, okay, this is much deeper and complex than just a CPTED sort of assessment that the likes of Luke and I might be doing, and George. How does that sound? So I'll come to Luke and George. Your initial thoughts on this type of research, and then how you might apply that as a consultant applying this type of research, and how it might adjust or help you?
Well, it would certainly be helpful from our perspective, Chris, as a As a man, I have a perception, and we all have perceptions of what makes a safe space. And I actually find it quite challenging to understand sometimes a woman's perspective. So one of the big things we do in our CPTED reviews or any security reviews, we engage with a whole range of stakeholders, male and female, young and older, to try and get a perception of what might cause them concern about any particular space. And also to take Codee's point about displacement, super important as well too. You're right, we as security practitioners often, our focus is not here, but if not here, where is it? So, with there's so many elements to consider, we just don't want to move a problem from here to down the street and push it on somebody else. That's absolutely that's actually a poor outcome. It might help our client initially, but long term, it's not really good for anybody.
I suppose it's measuring it too. It's capturing that. It's hard to do that as a consultant because your time is limited, and you don't often go back to the client and go, "Oh, how did that actually work?" I did some work with in WA recently with the City of Swan, and we did a number of clients, and it turned out some of the recommendations was implemented, but others weren't, and there's no measurement on the impact of that, and sometimes you wonder the value. That's always the question I've got is, does CPTED get enough recognition? George, in your role currently, but also the previous role that you had, how much was CPTED playing a part? Because around the building side, did you find that you're acknowledging CPTED and applying it?
Firstly, if I can say the research that both Codee and Codee are doing are actually very crucial to the next phases of what we should be seeing through the CPTED models. The challenges, I think we need to take a step back, and that is re-educate not only architects but engineers as well, because the biggest challenges is how do we all play nicely in that pool together to ensure that what we're delivering is for the holistic environment, not just for certain parts of the environment. So some of the challenges is at the moment, it's a guideline. So every state has a guideline. There's some federal items that have come out through ASIO outreach. You now got ISO. There's some other international guidelines that come into play, but they're all guidelines. So they're all referenced. And then us as security professionals, how do you then convince those environments that are being built to be built in a way that actually takes CPTED into account? And then how do you measure that? The key is how do you actually measure it after the fact?
And no one's doing it. That's the part. Well, it's not so much even how, but it's who and when.
Sorry, and I've got to put a disclaimer out there because I'm actually what's called a SABRE assessor. So there is a program called SABRE in the UK that goes in and does, it's sort of a risk assessment, but it's about the built environment and what actually happens in that environment. So whilst it's not there, like it's not completely there, you're right, there isn't something that does everything holistically. And the challenges is when you put something in place, e.g. you put a skate park so you can actually get the young kids there, then what else are you displacing? And then what else are you creating in that environment? So there's a lot of challenges, but we really need to take a step back and then engage with the architects and the engineers, very similar to the security overlay in REBA. And then how do we come together as a group to actually put this in place for the betterment of society? And I know we're going to talk about it a bit later, but I want to pose a question out there for later's topics, one of the later topics, and that is, what about drone landing zones for deliveries? Yes. So I don't want to answer it now. We'll wait till we get to the point. Well, just think about that.
I do want to cover it slightly in this part because we'll move from prevention to detection, and I think, and also CPTED plays a role exactly as you just said, either drone landing zones, but also autonomous vehicles and robotics need to have room designed in now, both on patrol, and you do design that when you're designing a public place. You make sure that emergency services have access, they can patrol the area, lighting, clear lines of sight, and same thing. But electronic surveillance and mobile electronic surveillance, as we're seeing, is still very relevant. Open it up there. Go, George.
Yeah, sorry, just one point. Can we just be clear between autonomous and automated? Because right now, a lot of things are automated, not autonomous. So
Correct.
the difference is autonomous is that so we've got to be very careful what language we speak.
And we deal with autonomous is that the machine is thinking on its own and making its own decisions. And so we talk about perspectives of space. Well, add a machine on, and what are the perspectives of a machine moving through an area, because we will be and are dealing with autonomous systems, autonomous robots. They may be automated in their path, but they will become autonomous in terms of their response. So, you're correct in the language, but when I say autonomous, we are moving to an area, a realm. Just have a look at some of the NVIDIA content in terms of we're moving to autonomous systems, and they're with us now. Codee, I was going to come to you. I've seen some of your activity recently. You're engaging a lot within the urban design and urban industry players, I suppose, or stakeholders. How do you perceive? How are they perceiving CPTED and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think urban planners and designers do CPTED, but they don't call it CPTED necessarily.
Yeah.
And in a lot of circumstances where I've been speaking to planners in council, for example, not in the operational security management side, but in the actual strategic planning side, CPTED sometimes can be a bit of a dirty word because they see it as a place killer, because if you just do a checkbox assessment and a set of recommendations, you end up with a very sterile location.
Yeah.
And that's, the lights are at a certain illumination level. You've got really good natural surveillance, so you can see everything that's going on. But because there's no interest in the space, because we don't have anything that could possibly be vandalized, or nothing you can hide behind, it's just like a box, and it's just empty and dead. So no one's interested in being there or hanging out there. So it's safe, but it's not being used. And that's where this idea of how do we think about place and making a place that people actually want to exist in, whilst making it safe and secure through CPTED principles, is really important. And to George's point about working with the engineers and architects, absolutely, they're the ones that are designing these places, but we need to incentivize them to design for good security outcomes. And to do that, you need to get in front of the clients, and the clients need to be pushing it. So we need to be speaking to developers, councils, state government planning authorities, infrastructure authorities, and so on, and saying, look, if you actually put this in your base scope of works or in your strategic plan as a requirement, as an outcome, these are the incentives that you're going to get. So for developers, it could be if we design a place that is demonstrably safe, is designed for people in mind from a placemaking perspective, you're going to get better revenue at your food and bev outlets. You're going to get better rents on your office because it's a more premium space. You can sell your tenants on that safety and on that connection. Those are the conversations I think security consultants generally don't have, but I think we can get a lot of value out of pitching CPTED and security in that way.
One thought comes to mind is, I think there's an opportunity with technology and this area is the digital twins. So we're going to be within this domain, and it's emerging very quickly now in terms of meta environments and the like, but that allows us to play around and demonstrate that difference. I think it's always been a challenge where you've already got the design and then do a CPTED assessment on a drawing or a building plan. It doesn't have the same sort of feeling as if you can start to walk through a space. Anyone currently doing that? ARUP, Codee, you're starting to see that within the larger consultancy firms, or even Luke, I'd be very impressed if you are, but I think the VR virtual environments are something that's going to come down the pipeline with what we're actually dealing with.
Yeah, we are a little bit, Chris. We've got a project at the moment there. We're part of a complete design team of all these independent agencies to redevelop a major park and turn it into a community space. So that's been really interesting in how we're trying to make a very, very large space quite cohesive and come together, but doing it in a really safe way. And there's a fair bit of tech that's being used in that to try and identify potential conflicts and, it's all these sorts of things up front. It's interesting with this because we're actually doing it for a government agency. One of the pushbacks we're getting from a CPTED perspective that's having a negative influence is maintenance costs. Like, they're just so tight on budgets. If there's a maintenance component, like, one of the things we like to recommend is tie security in with CPTED so it's cohesive. So, there's no point putting gates in if nobody's going to come and close them at the appropriate time or restrict access, right? But, to find budgets then for a patrol guy to come around every night, these are the sorts of things that, we're experiencing challenges with now, that if it needs ongoing budget, it's probably not going to get approval.
Yeah, interesting. And Kate, maybe your use of technology or how much technology might be starting to play within your research itself?
Yeah. So currently at ARUP, we're not using virtual technology for our crime prevention assessments. But a point I'd really like to touch on actually is we've started doing audits for particular sites after we've completed the CPTED. And we've been finding that as really useful to ensuring that we've got a comprehensive and a holistic security system that is actually meeting the objectives of the project. So that's something that we've recently started to play in. We do use a little bit more technology in terms of our nighttime vulnerability assessments. So these offerings are a combination of our security disciplines and our lighting disciplines, going out and actually inspecting the particular site, whether it be a park or a public space, and using particular technology to determine the levels of lighting. Is it uniformed? Is it overlapped? So something like that I can see be definitely developed for a more broader application.
Nice. And George, did you have much exposure to digital twins? I take it with some of the DCs that you were dealing with may well have been sort of digitally designed first.
Yeah, look, we did a lot of 3D modeling, not actual going into the more detailed environments, but a lot of the 3D modeling did help with that. So that's probably the first start of that, going down that more advanced path in the digital twins. So using that, it actually enabled us to reduce costs actually, because you were able to identify how do you actually achieve the best security outcome. Because let's be honest, everyone is given a bunch of money and everyone sees security as a huge overhead cost. And what value for money are you driving through security? And if you can show that through these sort of moments, so we actually would do a walkthrough and broader discussions around the environments and what value add was coming out of what we were deploying. So in the DC space, and I think it goes towards even the broader environment. So if you look at what's happening out there, the DCs are being built in a more let's call it domestic environment. So you're going to have all these other businesses in and around those critical infrastructures. Let's not just talk about data centers, but more broadly critical infrastructure. So it's integration of your general day-to-day operations of a takeaway shop sitting right next to a critical infrastructure. How do you mold that? Going back to Codee's point, how do you put that all together? How do you show the value that you're adding from a security perspective using the CPTED principles and bringing it all together without this huge overhead of cost that everyone seems to see security as? And going back to Luke's point, the maintenance piece. So you really need to bring in not only the architects, the engineers, and security at the front, but you need to bring in the operational people at the back and your businesses and show them the value of what you're putting together, and ask them what is their benefits and show them the benefits that you bring through the CPTED.
I think we can maybe learn from Paul Daly and what the police are doing. It's a working group. They don't just go, oh, here's how it is. They work, they get the stakeholders in, and it's about explaining that. And I think I don't think we do it enough. We were going to do a CPTED sort of workshop virtually, but I find virtually, other than getting a panel together, it's difficult to present CPTED to a virtual audience because it can be boring and you need to make it interesting, and it applies to everything. So you've got to create if it's a retail shop versus a public place versus a precinct, it's a real challenge to present CPTED so people understand it. Before I move into some of the technical side, the deeper dives, Luke, you mentioned, beg your pardon, Luke, Codee. Codee, you mentioned language of what architects and what's better than CPTED? Is it just simply safer by design or urban design principles that they tend to use? Is there your thoughts on language?
Well, I think,
because CPTED, I think, is, as you say, it sounds old to me. We need some, and it doesn't capture technology in the way that I think it should.
Yeah, I mean, outside the technology side, I usually use the words safe place or safe places now. So I know safety and security are slightly different things, but in terms of urban planning, they all tend to meld together at that strategic level. So I try to use language around placemaking, community resilience, those types of words, which can be broad topics, but you can bring the conversation in. Also, one thing I wanted to touch on from the technology front, talking about, your 3D BIM models and the like in design. One thing I have seen work quite well is on larger infrastructure projects where there is a customer-centered design process where, we're bringing in community members to sort of see what these spaces are going to look like before they're delivered. New train stations, for example. Yeah. They usually put on VR headsets and walk around, and I've worked with CCD designers before to put A/B testing in of different security arrangements from a CPTED perspective, and then you can get some feedback about, oh, that bike store really didn't feel safe, or this one worked better for me, and you can kind of see a little bit of how it might work better. So these new technologies and tools can be leveraged. That doesn't necessarily need to be the security person doing the VR model, because that's a very technical skill set.
No. Well, and absolutely. I'm not suggesting that we would create our own. It's actually, as you just mentioned, and I'm aware the Sydney Metro with some of the bigger stations have done that, particularly for customer experience and some of the stakeholders. But yes, absolutely, we need to have a security and safety hat element to that to walk through. And as you say, start to do some A, B, and C's of what it's going to look like, lighting at different times of the day, seasonal changes in sunlight. All these aspects become really, it excites me in terms of some of those capabilities to look at a space in that with our lens on. And I suppose one of the things you call it safe places, whether security, sometimes you don't want to use the word security because there's a perception of what security actually is. Luke, do you find that you do that? You adapt your language depending on the client or the project? And sometimes you have to take the security hat off?
100%. It can be depending on who the client is, who you're talking in, the audience, even whether it's inside or outside. So I actually really like Codee's language because we actually apply CPTED quite regularly to internal spaces too. But, again, the terminology of CPTED doesn't work so well. So, we would tend to use a safer spaces or whatever it might be when we're talking, counter heights and spaces to retreat. And, it's all safety and security in one. And yes, the term CPTED isn't really appropriate for it.
Well, you find it in this series as well. This was previously the Security Consultant Insights series, and I felt that security, I wanted to broaden it out to risk, hence the security and risk professionals, because some people don't consider themselves sort of that security, but we're all within that same game of reducing risk. So again, hence we do need to change our language. One area I wanted to touch on, again, coming back to some of the tech, and happy to broaden this out before we finish off, things like emergency signage and digital signage. Much innovation there. I was at the Vivid, so Vivid's copped some criticism over their interestingly over their drone show, and I had even tweeted out I got trapped out in that aspect too. I just felt the crowd management was really bad, and communicating with the crowd speaking to the local police down there was via Facebook. And I'm like, why are you talking to a crowd of 1 million people via Facebook? And where was the digital signage? I just didn't see it utilised. Just thoughts on digital signage, and I believe there might have been some standards, or I'm seeing some sort of workshop on this. I just saw it across my desk just recently. Should there not be a national guideline, or is there anything that you've seen around digital signage and emergency safety and security signage messaging, so it becomes standardised in our cities in Australia? No? Okay. Codee, did you see anything within the Metro project with public transport? They tend to have their signage pretty good.
Yeah. I think you know, from a signage perspective, it's really about understanding the customer journeys, and digital signage can be quite adaptable. I wouldn't want to speak out of turn because it's definitely not my area of expertise, but I know a lot of thought does go into how different people interpret the signage and how they can orient based on that. And you obviously have to consider the flexibility within the signage for unexpected events like security incidents, emergency evacuations, and those types of things. So I think with the smarter buildings are getting, the more you'll see sort of integrated digital signage forming part of that active building management activity. Yeah.
I've seen it more within Singapore. I was in Seoul recently as well, and they're quite advanced, I've thought, with their, not that I could read Korean, but you know, I could tell that they were saying something, and there was mixed languages as well. So you have to find your language, but it's there. Kate, anything that you're touching on with signage and messaging in relation to your research and public places for women?
So not at the moment. So my research is still in the early phases, but there's something definitely to be explored in terms of how we can improve that legibility and that wayfinding to particularly orientate that and target it for women's safety. I mean, at the moment, signage is great, but in terms of emergency situations, or, you know, even after hours, that digital signage and that ability to shift potentially throughout certain periods is definitely something to be considered.
Yeah, I saw it with the Westfield attack following. There was some digital signage within Westfield. They're pretty good, but there was obviously a need to respond. It'd be interesting to know whether they had that pre-planned or that was reactive. And I suppose lastly, I wanted to just highlight what we're seeing in the news, domestic violence in particular, knife-related crime. We had 2 significant attacks in Sydney, but you know, you talk to police nationally, and knife-related crime is a real concern at all levels. Places of worship and protests. Protesting is definitely on the increase as well. And we're seeing it everywhere. It's like unbelievable. So welcome to touch on any of those and where CPTED plays a real role, maybe on sort of design of a public place and how that relates to protests. Do we take protests into consideration, Codee, do you think?
Well, I mean, any you know, holistic security risk assessment should consider civil unrest and protest. Obviously, it depends on the community and what businesses and events are occurring, but things can change quickly. And you know, as we saw with Wakely in Sydney, for example, you know, it's not just the immediate event; it's also how, you know, people respond to the event, and that can lead to, you know, community outcry and backlash. And it might not even be a protest; it's just an unexpected surge of people coming to pay their respects. And if that's not managed well, then, you know, you have crowd crush issues and all those things that we're seeing in Vivid, for example. So yes, I mean, it should be considered. Do I have the answer? Does it form part of CPTED? No, but it's definitely something that security practitioners should be thinking about, because all of these things are quite dynamic, and everyone says it can't happen to me until it does.
Correct. It's a hard one. I had a place of worship recently, and someone had recommended a whole bunch of grills over this place in the current environment. And my recommendation was not to make it like a prison and overreact. And I felt, again, I was thinking about the perception of the worshippers themselves having to feel insecure or at danger of going into a place of worship. So it's a real balance and a fine balance. But that was my thought there. Knife-related crime. So New South Wales Police have got new wand powers. Does that make any difference? Is that a sort of target hardening police response, and how does that relate to CPTED? Luke, you do a lot in graffiti as well. I should have put graffiti in here.
Yeah.
CPTED and graffiti. We just had a graffiti attack on a politician, which is a protest and graffiti attack. How does CPTED play, or what would be your thoughts?
Look, graffiti's a problem everywhere. We really only sort of are starting to get into it just because of, you know, over all the years, just about every client we've ever had has been impacted at some stage by graffiti. But to come back to your question about spaces and CPTED, I think the assessments we do now have to consider different types of events. And so when we're evaluating a space from a CPTED perspective, we might be now evaluating it from a point of view that there might be larger gatherings in it than would otherwise be expected. The big thing for us, Chris, we're doing is not really a change in CPTED. It's a very big change in operational procedures. And really we're encouraging our clients and all the security people on the ground to really take a standoff position. Mostly, you know, everybody, well, big claim, but there's so many edged weapons out in the community now, and little kids carrying them, they think it's cool, it's tough, you know, part of their peer group. It's quite scary. And said we're advising our clients, especially in the sort of places of math gathering type spaces, that I think now just whenever you're engaging with anybody, just make the assumption there could be knives involved, and you just got to have this standoff approach, not get too close. So that's sort of how we're addressing it, Chris. And
that's police officers in Westfield shopping centres nationally have been issued with knife vests as well. Yep. So stab vests. So yeah, it's an interesting reaction, I suppose. Again, having to come back to the target hardening. There's always that fine line between, is it target hardening or is it CPTED in the pure design? And it's always hard to sort of apply CPTED retrospectively. It needs to be really within that initial design for it to really be a core function. And we don't want to impact amenity either, Chris, do we? So as you said before, you know, you've got to find a balance. If you go and put, you know, heavy grills and shutters on the outside of a church or a mosque, you're right. What does that say? Does it make people fearful of going there or attending? So, you know, that's the last thing we want to do either. All right. So look, we're running out of time. There's no questions from the audience, but we've had a reasonably good attendance today. Last opportunity for questions. But I suppose just a call to action or any takeaways that you might have. Kate, maybe for you to kick off is what's your timeframe? Masters, you got maybe a 2-year project. Have you got any requests from the audience that you're seeking any assistance or case study examples or anything like that?
So at the moment, I'm in my first year, so it'll approximately take about 3 or 4 years, considering I'm doing it part-time. But I'm happy for you to share across my details. I'd love to hear any personal experiences or case studies that I could draw off. And in later stages, it will involve focus groups and surveys.
Nice. Luke, I'm getting you two mixed up. But Codee, how's your PhD going?
It's going. It's definitely it's a big thing. But at the moment, I'm aiming to be complete by the end of next year. So, in the throes of data collection at the moment. Always happy to hear from anybody who's interested in taking part in an interview or doing a survey. So, if you're interested, look me up on LinkedIn.
And maybe just a quick update on what your research is. Maybe what's your research question?
Yeah, sure. So similar to what I've been talking about, I'm exploring how we can tie the urban design process, placemaking processes with the CPTED and the security activities. So how do we design places to be better with urban design in mind?
Nice. George, any takeaways for you or current advice projects?
Oh, look, just a couple of key takeaways. There's no one size fits all. We've got to keep that in mind at all times. But one thing that I'm trying to do at the moment is get in with those architects and those engineers, especially being a former civil engineer myself, and starting to drive those conversations through those organisations. and building that relationship and understanding that of engagement early through a security lens. And I like your point of view too, Chris, because I do reference it as security risk, and I have been for a little while, because it just brings a different context to the conversation. And if you look at the ISO CPTED, it actually references ISO 31000 as well as part of its guidelines. So it's already starting to bring those two together. So always keep that in mind, I guess, the best thing.
Nice. And Luke in Melbourne, and I think last week you were in Sydney, but how are you finding CPTED related work, I suppose, is a good thing from your perspective?
Look, there's lots, Chris. It's probably growing in awareness. The thing that's probably driving it too is the state governments for DA approval. So we get a lot of requests now. We don't prefer that type of work because we like to do work that's meaningful rather than just box ticking, but you can see that there's an increased awareness of the need for CPTED and the value of it if you get it right.
Yeah, I find there's two things from me. Yes, we've had a little bit of work, but I find CPTED assessments very challenging because it's hard to justify the time that you should be applying. And therefore, then if you give them the quote, they go, hang on, why are we paying all this money for a proper CPTED assessment when they do want to tick a box? And it's always that challenge. And then also I think keeping current with technology and what's coming through and the impacts. But I think that's another opportunity to talk to clients and make it interesting from an audience perspective. So, look, we'll keep talking. We'll always have CPTED within this series and get the updates, and we'll monitor this. Thank you very much to the audience. I'm going to close off now just with thanking our panel. George Dionisopoulos, Senior Security Consultant and ASIS New South Wales Chair. Kate Hampson in Perth, Graduate Security Consultant with ARUP and the NEXTGEN Lead ASIS WA Chapter. Codee Ludbey CPP Director, Senior Security Consultant with Core 42. Codee, are you NEXTGEN here in Sydney with ASIS?
Yeah, there's a few of us this year. I'm
Okay.
the secretary, and yeah.
Great. Okay, so just for anyone in the audience, the NEXTGEN with ASIS International is a good core group, getting younger people into the industry, which is very, very important. Otherwise, you end up with like me and Luke. Luke Percy-Dove there in Melbourne, Senior Security Consultant, Matrix Consulting, and we've been around for a little while. So, but that's the experience side. Also, a special thank you to Paul Daly, Superintendent Paul Daly in Perth with WA Police, and he's the chair of the National Police RPAS Working Group, and their opening session on the use of RPAS for emergency services. And just a takeaway, go back. We're going to be on the Sunshine Coast in a couple of weeks, 3rd of July. So if you're there on the Sunshine Coast, get along to Altitude 9 on the rooftop for a testing tech in paradise. We're almost sold out. We've got about 150 registrations for this session, and we'll be closing it off this week. So if you're there in Brisbane or close to the Sunshine Coast, or we have a 2-day event in Brisbane if you want to come along and get up to Maroochydore. The following day on the 4th of July, we have a Space as a National Mission session with Griffith University and looking at industry collaboration and current launch capabilities in Australia. So again, that technology play. And then also the following week, 9th to the 10th of July in Sydney with CubeSat Plus and the University of New South Wales and the Australian Centre for Space Engineering Research. So get along to that one. And this is all in the lead up to WA Space Week and the Indo-Pacific Space and Earth Conference in Perth, 25th to the 29th of November, and check that out and go have a look, particularly for the West Australian audience. Thank you so much to our sponsors and this series, and I'm pretty sure that's my last slide. Thank you very much to the panel and our audience, and I'll close off the session now, and this will be available on demand in the next sort of 24 hours or so. And we've got a comment there. Thanks all. Great. I'll close off the meeting. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.